Usually when I ask that question, like, well, what's wrong with murder? That's the kind of answer I get. Well, murder is when you take someone's life. Yes, now you've described what it is. But you haven't told me what's wrong with it. Well, it's terrible though. Why? Well, because the person, you took their life, right? So why is that wrong? Well, because you murdered them, right? Well, what's wrong with murder? Why is it so bad? What's wrong with stealing? What's wrong with lying? You know, a lot of these things we will find some kind of an exception for. And we'll say, well, it's okay to lie in this circumstance, it's okay to steal in that circumstance. So then the act itself isn't really wrong. The act, in fact, it seems like then the act is only wrong depending on the context. So if you and I are in the exact same context, but we're on different sides of the table, it's okay for you to lie to me, but not okay for me to lie to you. It's the same thing. We're both telling untruths. So then there's really nothing wrong with lying. It just depends on the context. There's nothing wrong with murder. There's nothing wrong with stealing. It just depends on the context. And I ask that question because when I ask you what's wrong with murder, I typically get I get one of two answers. I either get circular answers like that, like, well, it's bad because you take someone's life. That's just a description of what murder is. I don't know what makes that such a bad thing. And people will say, like, well, I mean, would you want to be murdered? No, but I also wouldn't want to go to prison if I did murder somebody. So does that therefore mean you wouldn't send me to prison? My preference has nothing to do with the circumstance, with the situation. And so if I were to ask you to really sit down and explain to me what's wrong with murder, I would bet that most of us would have a really hard time doing it without just like kind of relying back on, well, what it really amounts to is I was taught that murder is wrong. I was taught that stealing is wrong. I was taught that lying was wrong. And there's nothing wrong with getting our morality that way. We oftentimes will complain about other people like that, and we'll say, like, well, you know, you only think that because of how you were raised, or you just have your parents' beliefs, but there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, think about it, if every single person literally had their own ideas about everything, a society couldn't function. We have to have shared ideas. We have to inherit ideas from the previous generation. If we all come along in every generation, we completely change the way that everything is thought of, we couldn't keep a society together. It would fail, it would collapse. So there's certainly value in this. And so when I ask that question, like, what's wrong with murder? What's wrong with, those are difficult questions. And by the way, there are answers to them. They're just difficult questions to answer unless you really spend a lot of time thinking about it. And this kind of goes back to what Peterson was saying in Fix Yourself. There are certain things in life that we shouldn't spend too much time asking ourselves, how do we know what's wrong? How do we know what's right? We just kind of do know. And you can, for example, you can begin with this idea that murder is wrong, and then you can spend a very long time explaining it and coming to a real deep understanding of it, and maybe after a year or two, you're going to end up with the same understanding that murder is wrong. However, you'll know why it's wrong. And hopefully that being able to answer that one question will answer a lot of other questions as well. So that's why I asked that question about what's right and what's wrong. Let me ask this question: what's the difference between like the brain and the heart? Yeah, you can think of it that way. The brain is logical, the heart is emotional. And so you've probably heard me ask this before. Logic and emotion. So which of these two things should you be? Logical or emotional? Yeah. Yeah, I've talked about this before. Answer to that question is probably yes. You need both of these things. This is really fascinating. When I was doing my PhD, I did take a neuropsychology class. And it's one of those classes I wish I had taken it earlier. Although if I had taken it earlier, like as an undergraduate, I probably would have ended up doing neuropsychology for my PhD. But there was a case study, actually a few that were really fascinating. I remember this one that specifically struck me. A guy got a really bad fever. He survived it, but the limbic system in his brain just completely fried. That's the part of your brain that controls emotions. So this guy had no emotions. Make sense? So if you asked him, like if you did something in front of him that would piss off most people, it wouldn't make him angry. It also wouldn't make him sad. It wouldn't make him scared. It wouldn't make him happy. The guy had no emotions. He lost his ability to feel emotions. And so the video looks like it was probably from the 90s or so. And he's sitting at his table. Actually, it would have had to have been from the 90s. Because he's sitting at the table and his wife is showing him a newspaper of the genocide in Rwanda. And it explains, I don't know if you guys know much about the genocide in Rwanda, but it was really horrible. Like 1 million people were killed, I think it was. But they didn't have bullets. They didn't have guns. They ended up using machetes. So you have like this whole country where they just slaughtered like 1 million people with machetes, or 600,000, whatever the number was, which is a really horrible way to kill people. There was a movie about it years ago called Hotel Rwanda, which I think it won an Academy Award or something like that. But it's a fascinating movie. But in any event, his wife is showing him these newspaper articles about the genocide, and she's reading them to him, and she asks him, "So, what do you think about that? How do you feel about this?" And he goes, "It's very sad." And she asks him, "But do you feel sad?" And he said, "Well, I mean, it's sad, right?" And she was like, "Yeah, I mean, most people think it's sad, but do you think it's sad?" He couldn't answer that question. He didn't feel emotions. Now, you might think like, well, this is a perfect test case. This guy would be like a perfect judge. So maybe if we gave him some cases to judge, he'd be really good at it. Turns out, no. It turns out that most of our moral judgments come from this side of us, this emotional part of us. So for example, if you took a case before a judge, and the judge was looking for justice, and so the judge said, "I want justice," understand that word in there, "I want," indicates emotion. Want is not a logical thing. Want is an emotional thing. So if you went to a judge and the judge said that they wanted emotion, that they wanted justice, that would indicate that they're emotional. If you take the emotion out of it, there's no want. So therefore, there's no desire, because desire itself is an emotion. There's no desire for justice. So if you went to a judge and you said, "There's a case, here are all the facts," the judge, turns out, he can't make a decision between the two. So this is demonstrated. They take the guy who has no limbic system, and his wife puts him in front of a cabinet and tells him to pick out a breakfast cereal. And she opens the cabinet. And there's a choice there of like 3 or 4 breakfast cereals, however many it was. And then she tells him to go ahead and pick one out. And then the camera sits and watches him try to pick one out. In the bottom right-hand corner, there's a time lapse. He stands in front of his cabinet for 45 minutes. He never picks a breakfast cereal. Because think about the kinds of things that you go through when you're trying to pick a breakfast cereal. Do you want one that tastes, that word "want" comes up again. Do you want to taste good? Well, if you want to taste good, that means that you're trying to be happy. You're trying to satisfy an emotional desire. He doesn't have that, so he can't pick it on whatever is going to taste best. Would you pick it based off of whichever one's healthiest? That's a desire to be healthy. He can't pick it based off of that. This guy has no ability to decide between this case or that case, this breakfast cereal or that breakfast cereal, this side or that side in the genocide. The guy can make no decisions. She has to essentially feed him something. She has to prepare all of his clothing. She has to do everything for the guy. The guy just basically goes around and does what he's told. That's the logical side of you. Turns out that without the emotional side of you, you can't make decisions between good and evil. You can't even make decisions between these shoes or that shoes, this breakfast cereal or that breakfast cereal. And so when we say, like, as a judge, you have to be completely non-emotional. You have to be completely logical. You can't be if you're going to make any decision at all. The question becomes almost a Stoic question. Do you allow your emotions to determine? No, your emotions will determine that you want justice. And then your logic will tell you how to get justice. Your emotions will determine that you want a breakfast cereal because you're hungry. Your logic may help you decide which one to get. But you have to have both of these two things going at the same time. Even if you're trying to figure out what to do in any given situation, you might want, like, if, for example, I got a message. Oh shit! I have to message her back. I got a message a couple days ago from somebody. I can read it to you actually. And then she responds after that with just kind of like what it is that she's experiencing. She even tells me I actually happen to know who the person is. The point is that she's thinking like, well, I have to think logically about this. and she's trying not, and she goes into explain that she's trying not to put her emotions too much into it. But isn't that exactly what a relationship is? And isn't a relationship exactly something that's supposed to satisfy these emotional desires? People will oftentimes say that, well, I gotta think with my head, not with my heart. Well, no, dude, no matter what the situation is, you gotta think with both of these two things, because they're both you. They're both you. You're a logical being and you're an emotional being. There's a reason you have both of those, because you need both. If you didn't need both, you wouldn't have both. So the question now becomes, what is it that's informing these things? Where do you get your ideas from? So earlier we were talking and we said that we get them from family, you get them from friends, you get them from media, the things that you listen to, the movies that you watch, the books that you read, music, especially the music you listen to. And so it kind of begs this question, what is it that you're allowing into your heart? What is it that you're allowing into your mind? And we recognize that bad influences, of course, create bad outcomes. But we're not really honest about what those bad influences are that we allow in a lot of times. Think about, for example, the music that you listen to. If you had a son or a daughter, if you had a child, your little niece, nephew, brothers, sisters, cousins, whoever you feel like you have some level of responsibility over, would you want them behaving in alignment with the music that you listen to? In other words, would you want them to act out the things that you're hearing about in your music? And if not, what you should recognize is that the stuff that you're listening to is a bad influence. And you might think to yourself like, oh, but I can separate those things out. No, but can you though? Because that's the really insidious part about this stuff, is that it has a way of seeping in and affecting your heart without you even realizing it. In fact, the very fact that you can listen to music that describe and flatter just the worst aspects of human activity, and you can still sit there and groove along to it, should tell you that there's some level of impurity that's seeped into you. The fact that you can find joy or even like, some of that stuff, that should tell you that there's something that's seeped in. If you wouldn't want you have a little sister, a little brother, 2 or 3 years old, if you wouldn't look at them and say, oh, I'd love if they acted out what I was listening to in this music, then, but you still listen to it, that should tell you that there's some level of impurity. I don't know how much impurity has to go into you. Like your brain might work, sure. But man, if those things have gotten into your heart and we feel like it's okay to listen to that stuff or to watch that stuff or to read that stuff, then it might indicate to us something about an impure heart. So that's seeped through. And if this is affected, well, then this can't be clear. Just like if this is affected, this can't be clear. The whole part of you has to be clear. The emotional part of you, the intellectual part of you. Because if you're not clear, you can't make clear decisions, you can't have clear outcomes. So, questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticism, critiques? I feel as though I've lost you. Otherwise, I would talk to you about peeing in bathtubs.
What?
Yeah, those are my other periods. Talked about pissing in bathtubs.